It's Game Boy World, and this was 1989. The first calendar year of Game Boy's life was a momentous one. In April of 1989, Nintendo essentially created the handheld console market, giving shape and form to a corner of gaming that until then had existed as discrete, dedicated game machines. Sure, Handy had begun design work on what would become Atari's Lynx all the way back in 1986, and Epic released the cartridge-based Game Pocket Computer in 1984. That, in turn, was predated by Milton Bradley's Microvision way back in 1979. Yet these proved to be mere anomalies, blips on the video game industry radar. The Lynx didn't launch until after Game Boy, despite its head start in development. Epic's machine had only been limited to a small and obscure lifetime in Japan, and the Microvision was too primitive to last. In the 70s, the Fairchild Channel F may have invented interchangeable cart-based video games, but the format itself didn't gain traction until the Atari 2600 came along. Likewise, Game Boy may have had a decade of precedent, but you didn't see portable cartridges on sale at Walmart or Sears until Game Boy came. That was handheld gaming's big break. It was Nintendo's initiative to fumble, honestly. Thanks to the massive success of the NES, Nintendo had easy access to retail space. They could easily strong-arm any retailer in the world into carrying Game Boy. Not that they had to. Every toy chain, department store, and big box electronics seller in America and Japan wanted to be part of Nintendo's next big thing. Quite a turnaround from 1985, when Nintendo had to trick distributors into selling the NES. Admittedly, the big break represented by Game Boy proved to be somewhat dampened by the perception of the system as a child's plaything. Video games in general tended to show up in the toy section at most retailers throughout the 80s, and Game Boy was even more toy-like than the NES. Small, portable, low in power, and powered by disposable batteries. Let's be honest, the name didn't help either. One assumes it was meant to be a riff on Sony's Walkman, but calling the system Game Boy pegged it as something you bought for a kid to keep him or her pacified on long car trips. We were 20 years out from iPads, after all. Game Boy launched in Japan in April 1989 and hit the US several months later. It wouldn't make its way to Europe until the summer of 1990, in keeping with Nintendo's long tradition of not particularly caring about any territory that isn't Japan or, to a lesser degree, the US. In the 8 months following its launch, the Game Boy saw the debut of 25 games in Japan. Eventually, the system and its successor, the Game Boy Color, would boast an international library of titles 100 times that. But given that this was a new platform and market altogether, 25 isn't bad. Of those 25, only 4 games would fail to make their way to the US. Most of Japan's 1989 releases wouldn't come over until early 1990, and the game that eventually became Battleship didn't amble its way to America for a full 3 years. Given that all 25 of these games were developed in Japan, even those that amounted to ports of games originally designed in America, this makes a certain amount of sense. Japan was Nintendo's primary market after all. Still, it's telling that so many of Game Boy's early titles proved to be suitable for international release. It marked quite a difference from the mindset under which early Famicom titles were designed. Even if Japan came first, America and Europe were now important. The Japan-only games of 1989, particularly Yakuman Pachinko Time and Shogi, most likely didn't make their way overseas because they centered around uniquely Japanese pastimes. Only Master Karateka had more international appeal, but likely that ran afoul of licensing concerns and being relocalized to the US, or maybe it was just too dated. Game Boy's international outlook was also likely a case of developers hedging their bets. There was no way to know for certain how well Game Boy would perform at retail, so it made sense for games to be as localization-friendly as possible, the same way that games today tend to show up on as many platforms as possible. You have to hit the widest available range of potential customers to break even. What makes the first few months of Game Boy's life so interesting, though, is the breakdown of titles for the system. Some details may not come as much of a surprise, of course. Quite expectedly, 7 of these games fit into some area of the puzzle genre. That's nearly a third of all releases. Less expectedly, though, none of them fit into the falling block style of puzzle games that Tetris inspired, besides Tetris, of course. Instead, they were much more of the classic puzzle game mode a la Sokoban, which in fact made its way to the platform quite early under the name BOXXLE. Also interesting is the way the puzzle games progressively iterated on the genre over the course of 1989. Early on we saw the most basic forms of puzzlers, Tetris, Shanghai, and BOXXLE. By the end of the year we had Q-Billion and BOOMER'S Adventures in Asmic World, which felt more like advanced variations on those titles. Of course, 8 months wasn't nearly enough time for developers to take notice of other companies' early works and churn out a follow-up, so it's probably just a coincidence that they became progressively more complicated. Surprisingly, despite the relatively large number of sports games that appeared on the system this early on, there wasn't any overlap. 5 games, or a fifth of the library, none of which covered the same sport. The earliest of these were primitive and not particularly entertaining conversions of old NES games, but by the end of the year we saw both Golf, an excellent if limited take on the sport, and Motocross MANIACS, a genuinely inventive take on bike racing. Another surprise was the number of conversions from PC that appeared on Game Boy in 1989. As with sports games, this worked out to be 5 in total: Sokoban, Shanghai, Lode Runner, Tetris, and Master Karateka. All of these games were several years old by the time they reached Game Boy and felt like works from a different era, simple and primitive. Karateka was easily the most advanced looking, and even that felt painfully out of date compared to its follow-up, Prince of Persia, which debuted on PCs also in 1989. These slow-paced old PC games had simple graphics and often worked around monochrome blocks or text-based visuals, so they made a perfect match for the Game Boy's limitations. Certainly they worked out better on the whole than various attempts to create ports or sequels to NES games. Now, given the global dominance of the NES in 1989, it made sense for Game Boy to be, in effect, an NES on the go. In practice, though, the results felt pretty wildly hit or miss. Of all the NES ports to appear on Game Boy in the year, the best came from KEMCO SEGA. The Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle felt slightly more sluggish than the NES version, but it played identically, and very nearly enjoyed parity with the console release, arriving only a few months later. And then there was Tetris, which many people still regard as the definitive version of the game. Released approximately alongside the Nintendo-published NES version of the game, Game Boy Tetris may have lacked color, but it more than made up for it with rock-solid play and addictive head-to-head competitive action via the link cable. Special mention should be given to the games of 1989 that pushed the boundaries to produce a truly console-quality experience. Each had to make certain concessions in order to work within the limitations of the Game Boy, but already developers were aiming high with the system. 4 1989 titles in particular stand out in this regard: Super Mario Land, Castlevania the Adventure, The Final Fantasy Legend, and The Sword of Hope. Of the 4, Castlevania came off as the biggest disappointment, a stiff and clumsy platformer that abandoned many of the series' trademark mechanics and felt like some sort of off-brand clone. Outside of the exceptional music, Castlevania's first outing on Game Boy felt unworthy of the name. Super Mario Land fared better. It too comes off as a weird take on its series, yes, but it's one that holds up better on its own terms. Mario still moves and acts very much like you'd expect him to. Sure, the physics are a little off, the enemies are unfamiliar, and the overall experience feels decidedly short and easy, but it's fun, and its oddball breaks with convention laid down the foundation for a series that eventually came into its own when it stopped trying to be about Mario. Ultimately, it was Squaresoft that saw the best results of going big. The Final Fantasy Legend had very little to do with Final Fantasy, but it was by far the biggest and most ambitious game anyone had ever seen on a portable console. While Final Fantasy Legend featured a lot of strange and unconventional design choices and did very little to make its workings and intentions transparent, its designers made some very smart and player-friendly decisions that helped make it by far the least punishing 8-bit RPG ever. For starters, Final Fantasy Legend used its battery backup to allow players to save anywhere. This was clearly done in recognition of the volatility of portable play, preventing players from losing tons of progress if they suddenly had to switch off their system without being able to reach a fixed save point. But it also helped reduce the frustration of big dungeons and unpredictably chimerical party members whose powers and physical forms would change without warning. With its intricate free-form party mechanics and low-fuss save system, the Final Fantasy Legend wasn't just a great portable game, it was a great RPG by all standards of the era. Of course, as the Game Boy explodes in popularity in the coming years, we'll see more along the lines of BOXXLE and Castlevania the Adventure than we will the Final Fantasy Legend. The Game Boy offered a cheap alternative to console games. As development costs rose with the advent of the 16-bit generation, Game Boy's extreme constraints offered a development environment with little overhead. With talent and effort, the Game Boy could be made to perform all manner of wild tricks, but most studios settled for a quick buck. In all, 1989 probably represents the densest distribution of top-quality material the system would see in its entire life. 1990 would bring with it more than 5 times as many games as 1989, including lots of dull puzzle clones, numerous cynical license cash-ins, and a distressing number of variations on themes like pachinko and shogi. All told, 1989 offered some great stuff on the balance, with some genuine greats and plenty of relative sleepers like Revenge of the Gator and Quirk. Not a bad start for the system, and for the portable games market as a whole. For the best and worst of 1990s releases, keep reading and watching GameBoyWorld.com, and please support this project on Patreon.